So again, thank you everyone for waiting patiently. I apologize about that. My name is BJ Swain, and today we are going to be talking about how to think about space in magic as it relates to the world we reside in now, as well as how we think about gods and spirits for current things that exist in the world that may have not existed back in the past. So, a little bit about myself. I've been involved in studying and practicing magic for over 30 years. Really practicing things longer than that, but that's about the amount of time where I've actually been learning from books and teachers and things like that. Have been involved in a variety of traditions. Started out with kind of your standard neo-pagan Llewellyn book type stuff. Then moved into Reconstructionist paganism and ceremonial magic, because those obviously go together so much. Have not really done traditional witchcraft, but done witchcraft from family and inherited traditions, and have been involved in the AA and the OTO as well. So, the ideas that we're going to talk about today are very much rooted in animism. And so I imagine most people are pretty familiar with animism. The last conference I was at, it seemed like every other class that was being taught was a class on animism. So it's nice. The world is finally animistic instead of all archetypes and everything like it was 15, 20 years ago. But basically, the idea of animism is that we are able to relate to other things and interact with other things in the world as persons, regardless of what their characteristics or their nature is. Everything has some life to it. The world itself has life to it. And there is a personhood to many of the things that we experience in the world based on our ability to engage with them, not so much our ability to categorize them and try to classify them as qualifying with certain characteristics. And so that's kind of the basic worldview that everything we're going to talk about today works within. Now, from that worldview, you could have something that's very simple, just the sense that, okay, I understand that time has a living component to it. I understand the places I go have a living component to it. The things that I interact with have a living component. But there can also be bigger living components. Not all of those living components are just the idea that there is an interactiveness. Some of them are things that are more conscientious, more formed, have more personality to them. And that's where we start getting into the things that we generally think of as spirits. And so you can have things that are sort of spirits attached to certain places, certain types of places, certain types of things. And then you can have bigger spirits that have a little more authority, a little more power, more agency and selfhood, and some of those might get to the level where we understand them as gods. And so today, mostly we're going to talk about our places and gods. And when we talk about places, some of that will have to do with the spirit of a place. Some of it will have to do with guardians of that place. But some of it might just have to do with the types of spirits that reside there, or the nature of the life that that place has, and how that plays into the types of interactions that we have in those places. Now, a long, long time ago, in a galaxy right here, people came up with ways of understanding the places that were magical, the places that were special, places that were different. And people also understood who the gods were that they interacted with and how to interact with them, what those gods' areas of interest were, and how to appeal to those gods for help with those areas of interest. But we don't live a long, long time ago. We live now. And there are all sorts of things that people wouldn't have encountered back then that we encounter now. There's all sorts of places that we go now that wouldn't have existed back then at all. You get some things like here we're in a big hotel, and yeah, there were places where people would go for hospitality services back then. So that kind of thing is still the same. But airports wouldn't have existed back then. You wouldn't have a place where you'd go to fly all over the world. So there's a lot of things that are very much the same as they were, but a lot of things that are completely new and different. There might be some points where I kind of stop to reframe because I'm really not going based on my notes at all right now, which I think happens when I rush into a space. This is also my third time teaching this class this year, so trying to make all of them a little bit different. So we're going to talk about how to find what our relationships are with some of these other types of spaces, as well as some of the traditional types of spaces, and how we explore the idea of understanding the gods in a modern context, understanding spirits in a modern context, as opposed to the idea of thinking that we need to reinvent the wheel and kind of discover new gods or create new gods or create new spirits. And then that's not to say that it's impossible for there to be new gods. It is outside of the box of thinking of egregores and created spirits and created gods that was kind of the prevalent idea for a long time. It's more so thinking of the gods as things in and of themselves. And because they're things in and of themselves, they're things that stay relevant and involve elements of the world that maybe people didn't understand before. Now, a big question for that is, does that mean the gods change? And I would say through at least a Greek or Roman lens, we can say that for the most part, the gods were believed to be unchanging. There's some people who think of that as a particularly Platonic ideal, and then they want to write that off from all of paganism because academia didn't like to acknowledge that Plato and his homies were pagans back in the day, even though that's what everyone was. And so now people kind of have this like, ooh, Platonism. No, we don't want that. I guess there's an irony there that it's like pagans using crosses to keep the Platonism away, but also Christianity is just repackaged Platonism. So, but there are philosophers who talked about the gods as eternal and unchanging prior to Plato as well. Also, Plato, you're going back 2,500 years, so it's like, really, is that not old enough? If we think of the gods as unchanging and eternal, essentially the idea that their core initial natures exist outside of the space of time, then that's not to say that they can't have interests that are new. It's more to say that those interests are always there for them. They always understood those things that would come to be, and always related to those things that would come to be. And we have discovered them because we exist within the course of time. And so as we discover new things that are within the areas of interest of existing gods. And this is something that we can see historically as people move throughout the world. Sometimes as people move throughout the world by force. In particular, as we look at indigenous peoples in the Americas and African peoples being moved to the Americas, we see where there's combinations of religion and combinations of magic occurring with those peoples. And that involves finding ways where their gods and their spirits relate to their new context and relate to the new experiences they're having that did not exist where they were before. So they didn't find whole new gods and spirits. They didn't necessarily invent whole new religions. They understood that the gods and spirits that care about us and that are part of our communities, they are still over in the communities we came from, but they also are able to come be with us here, and they're able to have concerns that relate to our new concerns and our new experiences here. And so this is sort of an extension of that kind of thinking, that as people who have migrated from the past into the future by the natural means of descent and cultural evolution, we are in a context where we can still take those things from the past, those things that still care about us, those things that still have relationships with us, and find ways to relate to them today. So, before we get into how to think about gods in that context, let's talk about spaces. Because anytime we're relating to the gods or any other spirits, we're going to do it in a place. Now, a lot of modern magic for a long time focused on this idea that magic was done in a place outside of space and a time outside of time, which growing up I thought was really, really cool. And it's very mystical sounding and very it presents sort of an idea of the uncanny. But if we look at a lot of historical magic, time and place are very important because, again, they're alive. There are spells in the Greek and Egyptian magical fragments where you call upon the time because the time is a living spirit that is there that's part of the work you do. You call upon the space because the space is a living spirit that's part of the work that you do. When we look at the grimoires and the magical books that led to them, we don't just have planetary hours. All the hours have a name, which implies that there is a sort of spirit relationship with those hours. But if we dig deeper into that, you have in the Pauline art where there are actually spirits, angels, that are given for each hour of the day. And what's really interesting with those angels is that they don't change day to day. They just change who's let in to work with you during that time based on what their hour becomes on a different day. And so they have kind of an interesting agency that crosses over different things depending on what they're doing at a given moment. If we go back to the Hygromantia texts, which are really at the same time as the Key of Solomon, about the 14th century or so, we start seeing those, but they're thought to be from the 10th century, possibly as far back as the 7th century. Those also have spirits broken down for every hour of the day. And theirs, the spirits do change day to day based on the hour. So there's always been this idea in magic that the actual time you're working is important because certain spirits work better in that time. Certain spirits have relationships with those units of time. The Ritziel texts also focus on that idea where the angel Ritziel tells Adam that if you can understand the movements of time down to the quarter of the hour, you'll understand all of the secrets from which the world is created and all the magic of the world. So time is really important. Space is also important. In more folk and traditional forms of magic that we see still existing today, we get the idea that there are certain types of places that are more magical. But historically in learned spirit work, you also have the idea that spirits come from specific directions and that there are rulers of those directions that let the spirits in. So if you're existing outside of place and outside of time, then none of that ends up mattering anymore. And so there's definitely a framing where that type of work makes sense for certain things. But if we're doing animistic work and we're doing spirit work, the actual time and the place matter in that case. And so we want to engage them directly rather than try and say we're not actually part of them. And the first step to engaging them directly is thinking about where we are and what the meaning of that place is. So we can break down our spaces into a handful of types. And these types of spaces are going to be the types of spaces we look at, whether we're looking at traditional ideas about magical space or whether we're looking at new ideas about magical space. So those categories, and which, again, you can have relationships with things without categorizing them, but sometimes it's still useful to make categories. We have liminal spaces, wild spaces, haunted and abandoned spaces, and negotiated or constructed spaces. Now, liminal spaces, that's like the magic space par excellence. That's like what we all think of when we think of magical spaces. And really, when we talk about that time outside of time, space outside of space, there's an element of that that's saying the entire universe exists where we are and where we're working. And so whatever we do impacts whatever part of the universe we want to work on because it's all right there. But another part of it is creating this idea that's liminal, that you are in a place, you are in a time, but you're not exactly locked into that place and time. So it's still getting to the idea that liminality and liminal space are important for magic. If we want to think about liminal spaces in a more concrete, direct way that acknowledges and honors the space, though, we want to look at the types of places that create liminality through their natural features or through their purpose or conceptual features. And so when we talk about liminal, I feel like, again, 15, 20 years ago, that would have been a concept that would be new to like half the people in a room. But now everyone knows about liminality. Liminality is like at the center of everything in magic and paganism, probably because Hecate has decided it's her time to take over the world, and so she needs to be involved in everything, whether she was historically or not. Um, and so everyone's all about liminality, but liminality is pretty awesome. It basically means doorways. And so it's when you are straddling a doorway and you're in a room, but you're not in the room. You're also in the hallway, or you're in the room and also in the other room. You are on the line that's the border or the boundary between things. And so they're boundary spaces. They're spaces that are essentially queer. They take part in one nature as well as another nature at the same time, and so they're fuzzy. Like, they're not one thing, and so there's room for change and motility and things to be happening and stirring through those spaces because they aren't just a space. They're a collection of spatial features from different things. So the crossroads is our obvious liminal space, because in the center of the crossroads, you're not on Delaney Valley, you're not on York Road, you are on both, or on neither, or in between the two at the same time. Um, Now, going back to Hecate for a moment, Hecate is obviously associated with the crossroads, and so it's really easy to think like, oh, the goddess of witchcraft is also the goddess of crossroads. Those things both must go together. But really, Hecate is the goddess of crossroads because she's the goddess of torches, and she's a street lamp. You would have statues of Hecate at the crossroads with torches so people could see, because the crossroads were the more dangerous place because you had more things coming together in the crossroads. And so she was the guardian who stood there to protect you from things at the crossroads, just like she was the guardian that stood at your door to protect you from witchcraft and ghosts and unruly spirits. So a lot of her associations kind of developed over time out of these initial protective associations she had. But that doesn't take away the fact that she's eternal. And so that comprehension that the crossroads goes with magic is still kind of there in what she represents. And when we look at cultures around the world, we see deities that are crossroads deities or deities that are liminal deities, and they are the ones that give us access to the rest of the spirits that are out there and the rest of the gods that are out there. We work with them to give us the doorways or the roads by which gods or spirits are able to come to us and interact with us. And so crossroads have that nature of being the place where things meet, the place where things come together, where you can have travelers coming down a road and meet at the place where those roads intersect, and then they're able to work together or learn from each other. The crossroads has the idea of different potentials and different possibilities traveling through it, and then determining which one is going to emerge or which direction you're going to go from all of those possibilities. But the crossroads isn't the only liminal space. The seashore, great liminal space, and one that is very understood as kind of like a modern magical space, because big part of magical literature during the occult revival. The seashore, you have elements of the water, you have elements of the land, you have elements of the air, and they're all mixed together. If you're out by the ocean, like, I am very afraid of water, but I'm kind of calm about it at the ocean because it's so big and you can't get away from it. The air you're breathing has the ocean water in it. The land you're standing on has the ocean water in it. It's pervading everything. And so nothing that you're connecting with is just one thing. There's going to be some of the land mixing in with the water around the edge of the ocean where they come together. You're going to have the impact of the air moving across the loose sand and across the water, helping to shape them. They all interact as one thing, and so you're not dealing with any one thing by itself. You're dealing with the combination of these things. The edge of the forest. So not the forest itself, not the meadow, but the place where the two meet is liminal space, where you're able to stand and partake of the tamed, controlled, open, arable space and the wild, uncontrolled space of the woods where there's more unknown. Those things both exist at that edge, but there's not that combination in either space. Each space has its own magic, and then you have the combination of the two when you're at that place where they meet. Our other big liminal space that everyone's familiar with, cemeteries. You have a place where the dead reside, but the living go there. It's a place where it's not in the spirit world, it's in the physical world, but it's primarily for people that are in the spirit world, except that it's also for people that are in the living world to go see those people that are in the spirit world. So you have a space that has multiple layers of interaction between the same two essential things in terms of its purposing there. Wild spaces. So we said that the forest itself is not a liminal space, but the edge of the forest is. The forest is a wild space because that's a space where humans don't have control. It's a space where we don't know everything that is there, where it's easier for things to hide, easier for things to move and change and shift from the shadows and from all the things that can block out our sight and our knowledge of things. It's a space where things are undefined. Under the sea, so the seashore is liminal, but under the sea itself, the land under waves, is a wild space. Deserts are wild spaces. Like, we understand deserts as spaces of spirits where being out in the desert, you are more prone to hear their voices on the wind and have them lead you away, just like in forests. Haunted and abandoned spaces. Some spirits, they like some elements of humans having been around, but don't actually want to deal with humans on a regular basis because sometimes we are not the best neighbors or the best cohabitants. But there may be elements of being near us that are useful for some spirits, or elements of being in spaces where we were that are useful for some spirits. And so they like to move into spaces that humans once occupied but don't occupy anymore, or spaces that humans use and kind of occupy but don't remain in. And so you'll get in some Jinn traditions the idea that public bathroom spaces are a popular space for Jinn. And that's one where we would think, oh, that's kind of a modern idea. But in the ancient world, most bathroom spaces were public bathroom spaces. And so that's something that is an inherited old space of magic. Houses that are abandoned. Those are popular for spirits. If you look at a lot of the cunning folk texts where they talk about leaving a bucket of water in a place where you know that the fairies go, so that the fairies will come and bathe there, and then you can scoop their bathwater crud off the surface of the water and rub it on your eyes to see the fairies. It's talking about abandoned houses. Like almost every description of them, it's clear that it's an abandoned house that they're going into to find a place where the fairies hang out. Negotiated and constructed spaces. These are your sorcerer spaces, your wizard spaces. These are when you go to your local coven and you cast a circle. This is when you pull out a grimoire and you cast a circle. It's these are the spaces that you're creating by magic in order to create a certain type of liminality, but it's like a uber liminality where it's like you've got the space, the spirits of the space, the nature of the space. You've got whatever God's authority the magic is being done under. You've got the nature of your own soul and being, and then you've got the spirit being called, all coming together and creating this kind of nexus point that allows communication between our world and the spirit world by building a sort of liminal interaction between all of these functions and all of these parts that isn't there naturally. So this is kind of like the have magic will travel magical space. You can go wherever and create a negotiated or constructed space. Some of these shift as we look at modern types of spaces, and some of them stay pretty much the same. So in the modern world, some ideas for liminal spaces that you wouldn't have had back in the ancient world, or that would be a little different. And actually, this whole class idea came from discussion during the Witchblood class idea here at Sacred Space last year. Somehow we got onto this idea of new spaces and new gods, and it's like, oh, that could be a whole class. One of my favorites, and actually this one's kind of cheating because they did have this in the ancient world, and we already talked about how they were magical spaces in the ancient world, but street lamps. I think the way street lamps work now, it's a little different than the way they were then, because instead of just having a torch, or if you want to be really high tech, having bamboo pipe natural gas and creating street lamps in like China back before the Common Era, it's kind of like having candlelight. They're not really big spaces, but now we've got these huge towering pipes with lamps that are creating basically little magical circles of light that they cast down. And so you're in a place where you have light, but you wouldn't have that light if it weren't nighttime, if it weren't dark. The light space only exists because of the darkness that's there. So you can stand in this lit space that's like daytime and look out into the night space at the same time. And so it creates this sort of defined space that is defined by the difference in the world around it. And so there's an inherent liminality to that. Train stations, bus depots, and airports. These are kind of like the really cool, obvious ones for things we had today that we didn't have back in the day. These are also really neat because how many people are involved in any sort of like older living spirit tradition, like one that was not invented as part of the neo-pagan movement or modern magic movement? Okay, so a couple people. Those of you that have probably encountered the idea that sometimes when you go certain places, a spirit or a god might walk up to you in a human body and interact with you. And that's one that, for people that are not as immersed in spirit work or not as immersed in like older styles of spirit work, people are like, what are you talking about? That's really strange. But people that exist on the margins, people that are in fringe spaces, either because of the characteristics of their life or because of their internal mental experience, are often in spaces that are easier to inhabit by spirits. And so spirits can kind of hijack those people a little bit, and sometimes do. And so leaving offerings for spirits at a train station or a bus depot, you wouldn't want to do it in an airport, obviously. But at like a train station or bus depot, that can be an easy way to put it in a space where there's going to be people around that the spirits can work through and take and enjoy whatever that offering is. Hanging out in those spaces can also be ways that you're in a space where a spirit might be able to come up and talk to you and give you a message when you need it. Now, spirits also will find ways to do that when you are not in those spaces. I've found gas stations can be good for that, but I've also had this happen in places that are not at all spaces that you would think of for that. This is also a thing where if you're working with the dead a lot, you become more prone to this happening because certain types of work with the dead push you into a liminality where you are sort of partway in the spirit world. And there's management that needs to be done for that, but that would be a whole other class too. So maybe we'll do that one next year. Airports, I think of it as really cool ones because it's like you've got the whole world all connected through one hub. And so you're able to reach out to anywhere. So it's almost back to that idea of a place outside of space because anything can be connected with that spot that you're in right there. But even bigger than an airport, the internet. And this is one that I think is sort of weird to wrap your head around and weird to think about for how you would use this in magic. And I would love to say that meme magic is ridiculous and that it is obviously not a real thing, but we have seen the effects of it in the political spaces. And that's not even just kind of throwing it out there as it obviously had to be this. It's like the people that were doing it were actively choosing to do it, even though they were people that you wouldn't have expected to be doing magic. But the internet connects not just every place in the world pretty much, but every piece of knowledge in the world, the thoughts and actions of the vast majority of people in the world are interconnected through the internet. It creates a sort of liminality that embraces almost everything in a hyper-contextualized fashion that is always changing and always shifting and always moving. So ways to access that could be ways to access one of the most powerful and interconnected magical spaces that there is. Um, I am much too much of a Luddite to come up with how to do that, but hopefully some people do at some point. Yes.
Wouldn't it, the fact that it's all encompassing, but should be opposite of clinical?
Um, I would say it's everything still has its own distinction while sharing and connecting with everything else. So you're in a space where you can have multiple different things functioning and interacting at once to create an experience that would not be the same as the experience of any one of those things by itself. And so that gets into, like, if you look at ideas of postmodern art and the idea of pastiche, where you take multiple different sources and create a new uh, media expression through those different sources. Hypermedia is an extension of that idea where you have multiple different types of media in different locations being created at different times and spaces, all being able to be accessed and interacted with in ways where it creates a new individual expression for the moment in which it's being perceived. And so the ways in which you engage with it create individual experiences of all of that media interacting together at once. So I would say, in that sense, you're still having something that is liminal because it's creating something new by partaking of multiple things, and then able to reach out into those individual things as well. Um, does that make sense? As kind of, I think, did you have something also?
I was gonna say,
Yeah.
and probably ridiculous.
Yeah.
So for me, it's very paradoxical.
Well, you poke the bear on that a good bit too, which is one of the things I love about you. Yes. Yes. And I think that is one of the things that makes the internet like such a hyperliminal space, is that it is the number of boundaries that you are able to cross and interact with at once is almost infinite.
Well, things I've seen actually goes there and previous investigations in pretty similar areas that one spaces. They decided, of course, anybody who does not want this, they decided they would be at the Winchester Mystery House, which of course it's crazy place as it is, but we're also linking to other locations while we're doing this with other investigators.
Hmm.
They had phenomenal kind of almost sort of interact with each other across those accounts of that connection.
That's
Like almost something like that where we decided, okay, we want to pull from specific other spaces and basically group them in with that sort of real time. But yeah, also.
interesting experiment. Uh, the Essentially they had paranormal investigators working at the same time in different spaces, but connecting through like internet conferencing technology, and the phenomenon they were experiencing seemed to interrelate between the different spaces at the same time, even though the connection was through the internet rather than an actual spatial connection. So, yes. I think that could be a way to look at it. Again, it's something I haven't experimented with, and I will admit I'm a little loath to experiment with some of it. But the yeah, I think having a space that is creating and defining a particular group of interactions that people can engage with on maybe not repeated basis, but where they're able to engage with a similar set of interactions, then yeah, that would be kind of similar to creating a negotiated space using the internet. Yeah. So then, uh, wild spaces. This is one where, off the top of at least off the top of my head, it seems like something where it's like, well, that's not going to change. A forest is a forest. Like the land under waves is the land under waves. Like you're not having new things like that. But what about wild human spaces? As human settlements have grown, you have more types of space and more types of diversity of space and characteristic in those settlements because you have so much more space that's occupied and developed and so many more people in those spaces than you would have had before. So you have some spaces that are particularly dangerous because there's more social entropy there, there's more chaos there, because of the quality of life there, because of the impacts of society around that space and what people do to other people and do to spaces that they don't feel are important. We create spaces where there is more danger. And that danger, it's really easy to write it off as, oh, there's types of people that live there that, like, the way they live is problematic. But really, what we're saying is the nature of that space and the nature of life in that space makes things less controlled and more chaotic. And so there's more potential for things to happen that are not expected in other spaces, or things that aren't expected in spaces that are socialized and developed. So it's not necessarily that, oh, the type of people that live there, like, they're going to be more dangerous, because you could put any type of people into those sorts of spaces and you get the same things. You get the same patterns of language that arise. You get the same types of crime that arise, the same types of dangers. Focuses of them might shift a little bit by how people in those spaces are told they're supposed to focus on things and how they're told they're supposed to think about other people. But it's, again, not, again, going back to we don't have to categorize everything. We have to look at relationships. The relationship that society creates with the people that live in those spaces and creates with those spaces because of how we treat them. And David can tell you I'm being way more political than I usually would be. Is that we are sort of forcing a chaos. We're forcing entropy and destructive forces to exist in those spaces. And so we're creating wild spaces where humanity is part of what's making the space wild. We're creating wild spaces where the overpacking of buildings without protecting those buildings and taking care of those buildings is creating part of what's wild in those spaces. And so we do have spaces that are wild spaces now that are different from ones we had before. And I'm sure people who live adjacent to a large city or live in big cities have found places like that where there's a little more social chaos, there's a little bit more edge to the space, and there's a magic that goes with that. And we can think about that as other spaces that aren't necessarily wild spaces. Like, if you go to certain types of dive bars and certain types of bad neighborhoods, that's a place that Mercury's probably pretty chill with. And so we can find spaces where it's like, okay, these spaces have these elements that deal with these types of magic because of the way we have socialized those spaces and the way we've categorized those spaces and the types of activities and behaviors that we cause to happen there. Yes. So I think with a question like that, there is an easy impetus to speak for a spiritual power and try to say, like, oh, this is what's going on there, and be like, oh, Mother Nature is correcting, or she's saying, like, hey, you guys have been naughty in how you've dealt with these things, and so I'm gonna fix it now. But I wouldn't want to presume that and speak for nature in that way. I would say that it is very easy, without trying to speak for nature, to say that there is a push and pull that we create with the world around us, and that will eventually trigger things, either because we push things out of balance or we push things into a trajectory where they have to happen in a certain way. But there is also the chance that there are spirits in those places that want to protect those spaces, and want to deal with human elements and impacts of those spaces. And actually, the class that I'll be doing on Saturday talks a little more about that. The idea of how spirits of place and nature spirits become Fortean spirits and paranormal spirits and the spirits that we see in modern folklore, and how they maybe were helpful and friendly at one point, but because we're not always good neighbors, they become less good neighbors themselves. I think yes. Yeah. Mhm. Um, I would say that danger is a way that we can understand them, because things that will happen in them that are unexpected and that are out of our control. And most of us are not conditioned to deal with that on a regular basis. And so the idea that they can present things that we're not ready for, they can present things that confront us. Most people would understand that as dangerous. They can also present things that are good and useful. But danger tends to be how we conceptualize them and think about them, because even if we're optimistic people, we often have pessimistic expectations about things like that. So you could go into a space that people think of as dangerous and find things that are absolutely beautiful and wonderful there. And again, if you live near a major city and have been in like depressed areas of a major city, you'll find that. And sometimes they're expressed in ways that are different from how we expect because of the nature of the space. So the Magical Lodge that I used to be involved with was in a pretty rundown part of Baltimore, and once I went and parked there, and I guess I parked a little more at an angle than I should have, and there's a lady on the stoop across the street, and she starts yelling out to me, "Your ass is hanging out! Your ass is hanging out!" And I'm like, at first I'm just like, I don't know what's happening right now, or if this person's speaking with me, and I don't know them, so I should just assume they're not speaking with me and go about my business. And then, like, it becomes very evident that they are speaking to me, and I'm like, what is she talking about? I'm like checking my pants and everything. And so then, and she's just getting more and more frustrated with me that I'm not understanding. And what she eventually communicated to me is that because I was parked at an angle, the tail end of my car was sticking out into the street more than it should have, and I was putting myself at risk of getting my car damaged. And she was trying to help me so that I would fix it. Um, and so you get lots of people that they would be in that situation and they would just be like terrified. Like, I mean, we would have people who would come up and they'd see the neighborhood and be like, it is not worth going and checking out this magic group. And they'd just drive on. Like, I would be standing outside watching for people and see this happen. But the lady was being really nice and really helpful in a way that you might not encounter in a nicer space or more socialized space. Um, you get things where people would walk up and talk with you and ask about what you're doing, and sometimes they'd even be receptive to the idea that it was a magic group. In fact, we had tons of people who lived and worked in the building we were in, who they would like praise us being there and be like really happy that there was this weird occult sex magic group in their building because we brought the good vibes and the good spirits and everything. So, yes, you have spaces that are those modern wild spaces where they're frequently part of what makes them that is the perception that they're dangerous and that people should stay away from them. But once you're in the space, because it's kind of like a all sorts of things can happen that are unexpected. You could have things that are dangerous. You could get mugged. You could get shot. I mean, I also pulled up the space once, and there had been a gang fight, and a 5-year-old girl was shot and hospitalized. The like minutes before I got there. So you could have things like that, but you could also have things where it's like people are being really nice to you, people are being really helpful to you. You might find really beautiful art on a wall in an alley. Um, there's all sorts of things that can happen, but it's the fact that the unexpected and the unknown exists there and can just pop up in random ways. That's what makes it a wild space. Um, Haunted and abandoned spaces, that's one where really you're not going to have anything new. It's going to be the same sort of things. You have human dwellings, you have human business spaces, you have human spaces of utility that either stop being used or they're not used in a way where humans are regularly there, where humans kind of are in and out in a transient fashion with them. And the types of spaces that those are going to be uh, will be fairly similar in like the basic idea and nature as they were historically, because those are the same sorts of spaces. Yes.
One more thing on that note. I had some interesting experience building.
Hmm.
Feels
Yeah, no, I would say that that makes a lot of sense because one, you have there's an added liminality to it, which even like your description, like I could tell you were building that into making that clear. But you don't have the previous human.
never occupied.
Yeah, like I'm sort of loath to say energy because we talk about energy a lot in magic, and we use the word very incorrectly. What we really mean to say a lot of the time is light or agency, and those are still two different things. But we're talking about them. We talk about them as energy, but that echo of humanity, the imprint that we leave behind on the space because of the work we have done there by living there, that's not there in those spaces. And so the things that are attracted to them will probably be different than the ones that are attracted to those spaces that have that human echo without the humanity. Um, if has anyone done urban exploring, which is just like a polite way of saying you break into buildings, basically? Yeah. So I used to, if people from around this area, if you go down to Marriottsville Road at the edge of Carroll County, um, go through the state park, there used to be an old, I think it was a tuberculosis sanitarium, and then it became like a children's ward. It was called the Henrington Center, and my friends and I used to go hang out around there. Um, and it was seemed like a place that would be spooky inside. I heard lots of stories about people encountering hauntings and spirit phenomenon in there, and like people who were not magic people. Um, and I never experienced anything like that there. But I also worked to like cut out some of my natural senses with that because sometimes they were overwhelming. Um, but those types of spaces, people go to those spaces and they find that there, even if they're people that don't necessarily believe in those things or seek to interact with those things on a regular basis. Um, and so, while I don't think, well, actually, before going into how to interact with those spaces, we will probably see a lot more of those spaces soon, because there probably should have been a retail collapse about 5 years ago, and it for some reason hasn't happened yet. But it is clearly on its way, and so retail spaces will either become abandoned or become majorly repurposed as a result of that. Um, and so there's a fair chance that there will be a lot of spaces that had really wide varieties of use, which is going to color the nature of those spaces that will become abandoned spaces that spirits might decide to move into. Now, one thing for modern people with modern spaces, where it's not exactly new spaces, but our interaction with them, a lot of people will buy houses that have sat vacant for a long time because they're cheaper. Similarly, if you have like a retail space where you've got a mostly abandoned shopping center and a new property management company comes in and revitalizes it, you might get a bunch of new businesses suddenly moving into this space that used to be abandoned. And I think that is probably a little bit of a newer thing because like if we go like deep past, then it's like if places were abandoned, like your whole settlement was abandoned and then everything was destroyed and you built on top of the old thing. You're not moving into the same old abandoned houses. Um, so what do you do when that happens? Like you move in and it's like, oh, there's these spirits that are living there because they're like, yeah, I like to feel like there were humans around, but I don't actually want humans around. And then now all of a sudden there's humans, and they're like, no, no, you need to go, people. And so they start making mischief. I think one of the best starter solutions on that, aside from like the initial introduce yourself, try to negotiate out how to live together and both reside in the space, is rehoming. Um, Build a spirit house in your garden or in your backyard. Build some sort of shrine where you can show that you're going to respect them and that you are going to be a good host and treat them as a welcome guest so that they can also be a good host to you when it's their turn. Where you can give them things and give them respect and give them a space to reside without being like, all right, I'm going to come in and bully you out. I'm going to come and force you out. Now, if they don't want to do that and they don't want to get along with you either, then you may have to move to that step of kind of bullying them out or calling somebody who knows how to do that safely and have them do it. But that's something where it's like you might have to consider that as you're moving into spaces that were used at one point, haven't been used for a while, and now you're going to be using it. Negotiated and constructed spaces, again, because they're kind of they're the place you're building for a magical purpose that can happen anywhere. And you can have fixed ones, like temples are fixed ones. Or even if you don't have like an actual temple, which really is like a space where God resides. Like really, if you want to get technical, a temple, you pretty much have to have a living statue or something like that in it for it to be a temple. And hopefully we'll have more traditions doing things like that soon. But even if you have just like a magical lodge or a covenstead where magic is being done all the time there, that can change the nature of that space and create sort of a permanent negotiated space there. You can also do magical work to consecrate the space as a permanent negotiated space. And so, but those are things where those have historically existed and they exist today. It's just they exist wherever people decide to build them. And the nature of them is still going to be pretty similar, and we're at least inspired by old ways of putting them together. As far as having ones that are like you're setting it up for that individual use, again, something where you go back, you look over what we have written about magic over the last 2,000 years or 5,000 years, and you're going to see those same sorts of things. So that's not something that's new because that's the space that you put in your backpack and you take with you and you set up where you need to go. It's your tent. So that's always going to be there and always been essentially the same thing. So once you've got your spaces figured out, you're going to go to those spaces and talk to stuff and interact with stuff in them. And so that's where we get back to gods and spirits. So one of the big things is we don't want to treat gods like boxes of crayons. So, and thank the gods, that is becoming almost a cliche thing to say. Like it's becoming something that people are a lot more aware of. Like we don't have to go back to here's our tables of correspondence and here's 777 and we're going to pick a god based on, okay, it checks these 3 boxes in terms of relating to these things. They're people, they're persons, they have personalities, they have likes, they have dislikes, they have things they have traditionally done, things that they have started to reveal that they also do now. It's just like getting to know anyone else. And everyone has different areas of interest that they relate to. So like, if I was trying to figure out stuff about activist magic, I would call up David. If I wanted to know about how to run a really cool magic event out of a store space, I'd call up Matthew. And like these are things where it's like they have talents, they have knowledge, they have interest in it. If I wanted to look at how paganism can work in spaces of political power, I'd call up Gwendolyn. So it's just like people where they have different things that they know and do and are skilled at, but they also do other things. Like, I don't know what other things to point out for the people that I pointed out as examples there, but I'm sure like some of them are probably good at cooking. Some of them probably know a lot about art. Some of them probably are I'm gonna guess like good at golf is probably not one for any. Maybe, I don't know. Like, but people have different areas of interest that aren't their main thing. And when you look at historical magic books, that's something that pops up frequently. We're like, yeah, you call this spirit for these things, but he can do anything. All of these spirits can do all the things that all of these spirits are said to do, but they specialize in this area. But you can call any of them for anything because they're not one note, one trick ponies. They're vast, powerful beings. And it's almost, well, it's not almost, it is disrespectful to think, Zeus, he throws thunderbolts, and he's really good at throwing thunderbolts and seducing people in the shape of a swan, but he can't do anything else. He's got no other skills. So the other thing, gods aren't vending machines. You don't put coins in and expect cool stuff to fall, except you kind of do sometimes. Like, that is kind of what offerings can be, but it's about the relationship, not about putting a coin in and having like on demand. You get something when you put those coins in. So we want to frame them as people with areas of interest, but they also have broader interest and capability outside of those areas of interest. And they're people that you relate to and you get to know. And so you can understand more about them from getting to know them. And that, almost all of this applies to spirits in general. So, like, the divide between what's a god and what's a spirit, that gets into individual theological ideas that are going to vary from tradition to tradition and culture to culture. I think there is a difference. I think that you can figure out a difference, but I'm kind of happy in the space of I know it when I see it, and I might not always know it when I see it. It might just be I have an idea sometimes, and other times it's like, well, it could be either or both. And there's an element to that with not just magical beings, but magical function in a lot of traditional cultures, where sometimes Elizabeth might be an artist, sometimes she might be teaching a class, sometimes she might be a witch, sometimes she might be a goddess, sometimes she might be a Valkyrie. Like, there's actually like an old Nordic poem that like runs through like these people are this sometimes, but they're this that time and this that time. So this is an idea that happens traditionally, that it's not just like you have areas of interest, but you have areas of function. And that function can, in the moment, define the nature of your existence and what you are and what you're able to do as a result of that. Things have fluidity to them. They have the ability to connect with different types of polarities, different types of power, different types of agency, depending on what they're doing, that allows them to channel those things and connect with those things. So defining God and spirit, we maybe don't need to, again, we don't need to categorize. We need to recognize the relationships. And we need to recognize that the relationship with a God and a spirit is maybe different. So if I'm working with like some of the spirits in my spirit court, maybe I give them gifts when they do things for me. And doing things for me could be hanging out and having a conversation with me. It could be paying attention to me and giving me their time. Or it could be making sure I get a good deal at the mechanic. Or it could be making sure the book that I need to find at the library is actually at the library. So the transactional nature of it doesn't mean that the relationship element goes away. But for God, I might give them gifts because they exist and they deserve them, as opposed to they're doing something for me and it's purely transactional. I think, did you have something, Matthew?
I was just going to say,
Yeah. Yeah.
sometimes that's a relationship with the spirit. Sometimes it's also a friend that will help you move. Or it's all the see each other.
Yeah, and I think that's a great again reminder that a lot of these relationships and a lot of these interactions are very much like interactions we have with humans. There are elements that are different. Sometimes we really try to play up for people that it's like you've got to think about it like interacting with other people, because for so long people didn't. And like for one, they didn't even think of spirits and gods as persons. It was like, these are ideas, these are sources of energy, they're archetypes, they're psychological principles. And it's like, okay, well, maybe like let's recognize that they also are beings that have being and essence and substance to them. And so that comes with some personhood to it. It's like, okay, they're persons, but they're these persons that are way over there, and everything about them is super different from us, and it's very foreign and alien. So, well, some elements maybe, but not all. And so I think we're getting better about that, but we also can't overstate, or I mean, we can and we do sometimes overstate the idea that it's like working with a human being. It's like interacting with a human being, because there are going to be things that are different, but also interacting with people from different spaces and different types of people, and even people that are from the same sorts of spaces, is also going to be different based on like the individual person. So we want to take that into account too. To bring us back around to this idea of what's different now versus the past. If you close your eyes for a second and think about what the world was like 10 years ago. So 10 years ago, that puts us at 2015. We did not have a reality show person as our president in 2015. That would have seemed ridiculous then. Then you go back 20 years ago, back to 2005. You weren't carrying a smartphone in your pocket. We had not had a mixed race president at that point. We were quasi in control of England's prime minister, I think, by then. Go back 70 years, and you're starting to hit the invention of American modernity. American car culture begins around that point. That's where I think 70 years ago takes us about to the GI Bill. So you have greater proliferation of college education amongst Americans. You have the movement from cities to suburbs happening around that time. Go back 100 years ago. Not going to be super common for everybody to have cars. Then 200 years ago, America's just getting started. 1,000 years ago, the shape of religion and culture was entirely different. People didn't even know about Turtle Island, or whatever other name we want to use for this rock that we sit on here. 2,000 years ago, you barely have, actually Jesus hadn't even started preaching yet by that point. So over time, things change hugely. And again, even just looking at 10 years ago, our issues, our thoughts, our things that would concern us, completely different from what they are now. And going back 20 years ago, the technologies that we take for granted, that we use every day, like almost every minute of the day, were not there. So why should we expect that our relationship with the gods and our relationship with spirits is going to be the same as it was 2,500 or 5,000 years ago? We can have relationships with the same gods and spirits, but there's going to be things that are going to be different about them. There's going to be things that we understand about them differently. There's going to be ways that we interact with them that are different, because what we have to interact with them is different now. And there's going to be things that are concerns that we have that we wouldn't have had at that time as well. There's also still continuity over time, though. A lot of the past is closer to us than we think it was. If we look at how many generations away from slavery we are, it's not that far. I think I just have to go to my great-great-grandparents, maybe great-grandparents, to have somebody that was enslaved. The Great Depression, like I used to have clients that grew up in the Great Depression. Those of you that are older than me probably knew a lot of people who grew up in the Great Depression. The Holocaust. I literally had a client who jumped from a train to escape the Holocaust. And I would imagine most people in the room have met someone or met someone who has met someone who escaped or was directly touched by that event. The Cold War, like I have a friend who was born in 2000, and he is always like, I think of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Cold War as like this history thing that was like way long ago. He's like, but you were still dealing with that when you were growing up in an elementary school. Like, there's a lot of things that seem remote and seem far away because the world is so big and things change so fast, but they're actually really close to us. So while we can talk about the fact that our relationship with the gods changes over time and that vast changes happen very quickly, we also have to remember that there is a continuity to human experience and that some things are not super far away. There are things that we're still impacted by that we think of as the distant past, but they're still very related to what our experiences today are. And so there are going to be concerns and needs that remain the same. You'll see anyone who's been in any online forums, especially like the really big online witch forums, 10, 15 times a day. How do I make my man come back to me? How do I make him not love anyone else? How do I make this beautiful person I'm afraid to talk to fall in love with me? And most people are like, magic has never been used for that and can't ever be used for that, and you'll lose all your magic and the world will fall apart. And then the rest of us are like, well, really, like 90% of spells through all of history were for those purposes. There's still concerns that people have. There's still things that everyone deals with. Or not necessarily everybody, but everyone is going to deal with a range of concerns that have always existed. People will always need to eat. People will always need places to live. People always need resources. So maybe not money. Maybe we've had societies where money hasn't been the exact way that people have transacted, but they've still needed some sort of resource to transact with. And that will probably always be the case, regardless of what types of social structures we put in place. But then there are desires that are much newer. One of the ones I have here is social mobility, because that's something where, especially around like the 1980s, the idea of social mobility was a huge thing, with like yuppies, young upwardly mobile people. And so there was this idea that this is revolutionary, that people can change their status and change where they are in life so much more easily than the past. And then looking at historical magic things, when we look at kind of the shift from more Catholic magical texts to more Protestant magic texts, there's more of this idea of being able to move up and down in society and culture a little bit. But it's always existed. If we look back at like the Anglo-Saxons, they had codified how you moved from one rank in society to another. So social mobility is probably not actually new. But some of the ways that social mobility works and some of our social structures are new, and that's going to impact how we think about what we need and what we want. Obviously, technology. There's lots of technology that's new that didn't exist before, and we have technology again that didn't exist like 5 years ago that we probably use pretty regularly. So how do we think about how we engage with those things? How do we think about what gods and what spirits we look to help us with those things that just didn't exist before? Or things where maybe some version of it existed, but it's very different now than it used to be then. And when we look at an old book of magic and it's like, call on this spirit to make the local lord think you're really cool. It's like, well, we don't have local lords now, but I've got my boss, or I have my teacher, or I have this person who's in charge of this thing in my community that I'm involved in. And so some of those things are really easy to think about and really easy to frame, but there's other things that are more complicated. Um, so, okay, yeah, here we go. So, like, for example, well, actually, I guess before getting to examples, to me, the idea of how we approach that, it can be a matter of finding new gods, which I don't think is the same as inventing new gods. We don't need to necessarily say like, I need a god of this, so I'm gonna give this name, and I'm gonna make these symbols and signs for it. I'm gonna get a bunch of people together, and we're gonna like focus really hard, and then this god is gonna come into being. But maybe gods can introduce us to gods that we didn't know about before. Maybe we can find people or beings that have been elevated to a divine status, who maybe are connecting to some god nature or power that pre-existed them, but we didn't have something through which it was expressed before because we didn't need it. So the Catholic Church really actually is very good at this. They have their whole process for recognizing saints. And so what I think a lot of people don't understand is everybody, when you die, you become a saint. So it's presumed that everyone ends up in heaven, and therefore that's what being a saint is. Canonized saints are people where something has happened that has confirmed that they are there and that they have God's ear and can make stuff happen on earth. So the church doesn't create saints. The church watches for stuff to prove that someone is a saint, and then they're like, it's canon, baby. Like, maybe we don't read those old Star Wars books, but these new ones, they're saints. So I think it can be harder outside of those sorts of big structures because we don't have someone centralized to come up with like, okay, these are the things that prove to us that this person has been elevated to God status, or that this new God that someone has heard of is actually real. We don't have a clear means of vetting things. And we also have this idea that UPG is like a dirty word. So for anyone unfamiliar with UPG, which I imagine is probably like no one, but just in case, unverified personal gnosis, or spiritual knowledge that you gain from your own experience, but has not been confirmed in some sort of concrete way. And typically, like, you experience something in a vision and it tells you something, and then I go like, hey John, can you go like call up a spirit and ask it if this is true? Then John just has some other UPG. That doesn't actually verify my UPG. But if a spirit comes and tells me like, hey, back like 200 years ago, there was this thing that happened in this place, and then I go find a book that tells me there was a thing that happened in this place, then it's verified. Like, I found a concrete way in the world to verify it that is not based on something where I have preceded someone into having an experience. Or alternatively, if a spirit comes and tells me something, and then it tells Solomon the same thing, and we haven't discussed it, and then it tells Ivo the same thing, and he hasn't discussed it with Solomon and I, and we all come together and we're like, hey, I had this vision, and the spirit told me its name is this, and it told me its sign is this, and we've all got the same name and the same sign, that's probably verified. But we don't necessarily have to always look for something new. Sometimes we can understand something that already existed. And so I think a great example of this is electricity. In Jewish law, electricity is fire. It's treated with the same rules and laws that fire is treated with. Obviously, electricity existed. Again, gods are timeless. They exist outside of time. But people didn't know about it. People didn't have a perception of needing it. So it wasn't something people were aware of. Eventually, people become aware of electricity. People use electricity, and then people get to the point where they're like, I really need this electricity stuff. But in a religious context, you've got to still have rules for it, potentially. And so instead of saying, all right, we need to have a bunch of people get together and create new rules for electricity, it's like, well, we've already got rules. We've got rules for fire. It behaves like fire. It acts like fire. It does things that fire does. Electricity is fire. So we can see where there are things that relate and that are similar, and from that similarity, we can understand that those things which already exist apply to it. So like medicine. What we understand as medicine today and what we understood as medicine 2,000 years ago are very different. That doesn't mean that Hermes and Asclepius can't still address modern medicine just because it's different from ancient medicine. You've got other things that are a little less obvious. Wow, my next example is airline and train travel, which is still basically Hermes. So let's skip that one. But cars, and I guess I kind of just teed it up that cars don't have to also be Hermes. Who would you call on if you were having a car issue? Um, and it's, I guess, like, let's keep it in the lingua franca, and like if you were thinking like Greco-Roman world, because then we can kind of go interpretatio Romano out from there. But anyone have any thoughts about who in like of Greco-Roman world deities? And obviously, I know that they are not the same, but close. Yes. Okay, so that's a possibility. So were you also going to go with Hephaestus? Yeah, so Hephaestus might be really good if you are a mechanic or if you are a machinist, and if you're making the parts or calling on somebody who is dealing with the individual parts of a car. Mars, if you're dealing with the car itself, because Mars rules over chariots. So cars are basically chariots. So, but you've got different angles you can work there, and I think that's an important element of this. Hephaestus came up at ConVocation for this too. That depending on what your issue is related to the car, maybe Hephaestus is better to call on. Maybe Mars is better to call on. Maybe you want to call on both of them. Sports. Anyone have an idea for who you might call on for sports? And we can go ahead and get a little broader if you can give like a little context for the god or spirit that you're talking about. We've only got about 4 minutes, but I think it goes into a break time after this. So if people want to drift out, that's fine. But if people want to talk a little bit more, then that's fine too. Yeah. Uh huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Important um, thing, like that synergy would have lent to more victory. Mercurial aspects of it have been taken care of. And I think also adding like Venusian or even solar aspects leads to the actual victory
Yeah.
in sporting, whereas like too much Mars can just be violence for the sake of violent state,
Mhm.
not necessarily a favorable outcome.
Yep.
Flip of the coin.
You, you just ran through like all the examples that I would give there. It's like Mars would be my starting point, and yeah, Mars can hurt. I used to put martial seals on my arm before fencing competitions, and then invoke the spirit of Mars to like consecrate that part of my body, and it created pain over time. Also, really violent, intense dreams about the nature of God's anger and God's violence. But yeah, Mercury or Hermes rules over games. You've got again Venus for victory, the Sun for glory. And with if we're going with gods rather than just the planets, you don't just have glory with the sun, but Apollo as an archer, and Apollo as kind of a god for musicians and bards, where that fame extends out through there as well. And so again, you've got different elements of the concept which might have you call on different gods because of the specific element you're dealing with. Now, sports again are one where it's like we can really say like easily like Mars is a link because like the Campus Martius was where sports were played in Rome. We know in the ancient world that sports were considered mostly ruled by Mars. But like television is something where they didn't have that. Um, and so you could break that down where you've got broadcasting, you've got watching, you've got production, you've got auditioning, acting, things like that. So you might have Dionysus in there for theatrical elements. You might have, again, Apollo or Hermes for communication and storytelling. You might have Hermes, again, for the broadcasting component of it. Venus for kind of art components of it. There's lots of different gods and spirits that might deal with different pieces of it. And so sometimes it's not just that we have to say, okay, what's this thing that I'm dealing with? But it's like, well, what are the parts of that thing? And how do we deal with those specific parts? And how do those relate to what we specifically want to do with it? And from there, we can pick which gods and spirits we're going to work with. I don't know why this did not occur to me before, but almost all my examples, like Hermes. And it's, I mean, I was like big about Hermes when I was like a teenager and like in my early 20s, like that was my life. But because like other examples I've got on here, computers and the internet. And it's like, really? Like, those are. But then to go back to like for the last piece to touch on here, um, some of the social things and political things, religious persecution, other forms of persecution, racism, LGBTQIA issues. Uh, those are things where it may be very important to us, especially these days, to find gods who would be gods we could call on for that. And I don't know, Gwendolyn, are you doing your hero class at this? Not this time. So Gwendolyn has a really great class on heroes, and that was one of the things Gwendolyn talked about it when I saw that class was looking at heroes that specifically relate to the issues that we're dealing with in America now. And like back during the last American Dark Ages, I wrote some blogs about the American state religion because we do have a state religion and it is pagan. Um, the idea that while we mostly have goddesses in our state religion, most of our heroes are male, and so that we can look to those heroes for a lot of the issues that we have today. Now, those heroes are not going to be great for actually for religious persecution. A lot of them would be pretty good, but for other forms of persecution, for racism, for LGBTQIA issues, maybe some of America's founding heroes are not the heroes that we want for those issues. I am a little more generous to them than a lot of people are. That I know a lot of like their views were going along to get along, as opposed to them being like, I really love slavery. But um, but the fact that like they went along to get along, they still might not be the people to call on for like, hey, why don't you fix the mess that you didn't fix back then? But I guess there was like that controversy with conferences a few years back around Harriet Tubman when Witch Doctor Utu was teaching about the magic of Harriet Tubman. But she would definitely be a figure to call on for things like that. And that's getting to where we're starting to deal with more heroes than with gods. But there are probably gods that we can frame for those things as well. A big thing in Indo-European mythology is the idea that on both sides of the divine conflict, you have an inside outsider. And so basically, you have a mixed heritage god. And so, like, you have Lulam Fada and you have Bress for the Irish pantheon. Um, one of them has a parent, both of them have a parent that's from the Tuatha De Danann, and both of them have a parent that's from the Fomoroi, from Moira. So those figures where they are mixed heritage or mixed race figures in these very European pantheons, they're figures that we might be able to call on for some sorts of racial persecution and issues of racial division because they're inherently navigating that in their own stories where they're partaking of both sides. And even if they're on one side, they're able to lead elements of the conflict because of their nature of being of both sides. Yes. Yeah. No, that would make a lot of sense for some of those issues. Um, and so I think we've got a lot of figures that we can mine as heroes for that, but then also we have gods that we can definitely look to. Like Apollo's great love is a homosexual love, and so calling on Apollo for LGBTQIA issues makes a lot of sense. There's the growing cult of Tuer Shen in Taoist spirituality, where you've got a god who's like specifically a god of gayness and homosexuality. So there are gods out there where we can find those elements of their stories, and sometimes when we do that, we sometimes have a tendency to take elements that look a little bit like something today, but that were not the same thing as the thing today. And then we're like, this is a God who experienced this thing that we're dealing with. This is the God to call on for this. And I think we should be careful about that. That we can't like reverse engineer the gods into being what we are today. But we can maybe look at them and say they have sympathy for what we're experiencing today because they have something that's like what we are experiencing today, even if it's coming from a different place or has a different function or nature. We can also look at gods where we can say, like, okay, they maybe didn't go through anything that is particularly the same as what we're dealing with, but they did deal with things that are related to it. So, like, a lot of people think Zeus, like, oh, that's the big status deity that you would not call on for rebellion. But Zeus killed his dad because his dad was like the symbol of the old order of creation that was not cool anymore. So that's pretty punk rock. And I may be like the only person ever to stand up and be like Zeus is pretty punk rock, but he kind of was in a way. So there are ways where you can look at that and be like, hey, maybe not exactly the same, but Zeus himself relates to some of the issues that we're dealing with today and overcoming some of those sorts of restriction and the idea of chaotic rule in order to create a rule that is more ordered and more harmonious and more about the preservation of the cosmos as it's supposed to be, as opposed to the authoritarian despotic rule of the previous order. So sometimes we also have to break out of our own framing of what kind of the popular thoughts about these gods are and look at what actually was going on with some of them and what this actually meant as far as their stories go and how those stories have meaning based on their conversation with the events and experiences of humans today. We've got to apply a little bit of audience reception there. And so, again, audience reception can kind of take us to those spaces where we're like, Zeus is a statist and he's on the bad side of things. But audience reception can also be like, Kronos is the bad guy we're dealing with now, and so Zeus is the hero we want. Um, so a lot of that becomes about framing. So that is pretty much what I have for this. So I didn't talk about this in the beginning, but this is my last round of conferences this year. This is my last conference in this round for this year. So all the stuff that I presented through the year will go up online for people to be able to listen to otherwise. So if there's things you want to revisit from today, this will be up online for free for you to look at, as well as the two other versions of it that I taught, and each one is slightly different. The animism in Avatar class, I only did that at one conference this year, and so that one's already up if that's something that you would have been interested in if I was teaching it. But I will have some flyers with some QR codes that I'll pull out and I'll have up here if anyone wants to grab them, and then you'll be able to find like my books, my classes, all the free stuff I've got out there, all through those QR codes. Usually I would hand out something for people to sign up for me to like email out, but then I never actually create the email lists. So I'm just gonna hand out QR codes. I also have some of my books if anyone's interested in them. They're not down at the book seller thing yet because I was late today. But also hopefully I should have more of them shipping in tomorrow. So tomorrow afternoon is probably when I'll have them with the bookseller thing. But you can get them $20 a book from me here today as well. So I'm gonna be up here for a few minutes because I think we're letting out now. But again, I think there's a little break time. So if you've got questions or want to grab stuff from me, then feel free to come up and do that. And thank you all for waiting for me. Thank you for your patience. I'm so appreciative.